Hey, Chris.
Hey, Kaveh. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're excited here to talk about this topic. I know I've been talking with many of you this morning, and I know AI is top of mind to many people here. So let's just jump right into it, if you don't mind, Kaveh.
Sounds great. Sounds great.
You know, we've now had 2 years of maybe experimentation, maybe is a way to say it, of using generative AI. And I'd like to understand, like from a healthcare industry perspective, what is the most surprising development that you've seen?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because, a couple of years ago, it entered into our public consciousness as this basically question answering machine. That's really what people thought it was, a question answering machine. Mm-hmm. But underneath it was a pretty profound set of technologies that allowed that experience that we were all having in our ordinary lives. And I work on this category of technologies and how it affects businesses. I've spent the majority of the last 2 years, and I'm continuously amazed by what is actually possible, separate and aside from the experiences that people have right now. I think a couple of things that are really becoming clear. One of them is that underneath all of this technology is the fundamental ability of artificial intelligence to understand the meaning of spoken and written speech. Mm-hmm. Something that we couldn't have accomplished until generative AI became available. And when we first thought about it, we said, well, this is kind of cool because it turns out 40% of everybody's job involves language skills that the technology can somehow either automate or augment, and it would matter in work. But what we didn't really understand fully was that because it understands what you mean, it actually changes the way you can interact with information and other kinds of technology. So in the coding world, for the last 2 years, we've seen a migration from what was called instruction-driven coding to intent-driven coding. What does that mean? You don't actually need to code or know how to code to generate code. You just need to describe what you want the technology to do, and the code gets generated. And that actually, if you are following what's happening, it's causing a massive reduction in jobs in the technology sector. I told my kids a decade ago when they went to college, they all needed to learn how to code. Terrible advice. Nobody needs to learn how to code. But that's being translated into someplace else, which is the way we interact with technology. You don't need to be given instructions on how to interact with technology. You talk to it like a human being. You just talk to it and ask it questions like a human being. And we are increasingly going to see that when we do our work and we need a technology part of our work, it'll be like talking to a person. Mm-hmm. You can talk over it, you can argue with it, you can interrupt it, you can use colloquialisms, it will figure it out. That's crazy.
That is crazy.
We did not think that was going to happen, although, I mean, the people close to it did, but I think that was one big surprise. There are other big surprises, but I'll start there.
Right, I think that's a really good one, and that kind of speaks to, for people that are laymen about this generative AI, what is it? It's a magic box that you type something in, and you get good answers from. Maybe you could share a little bit about some of the things that are driving this ability for you to be able to interact with
I think it's important that we all have an actual understanding of what this magic box is, because it's not always well understood. So artificial intelligence as a capability is almost 40 years old. And it was largely a technology asset, math and computer science, that was used for us to understand and analyze information and predict next best actions. Mm-hmm. However, in order to get it ready, you had to train it. And to train it, you had to have reference information, so-called labeled data, that would then train the model, and then you could use the model to do other things with it. You could show it new data, and it would use the same model to do the next thing. And that was fine, but it really had a relatively esoteric sliver of use. Mm-hmm. And as we were looking around for big, hairy problems that we couldn't solve, one problem that we never were really good enough, technology was never really good enough, was understanding the meaning of language, which is why search and other things were always very difficult. And we took natural language processing, for example, and we put AI on it, and maybe it was right 80%, 90% of the time, but that was interesting but not important. Well, it turns out that the technology can understand language, but there was no way we would ever have trained it with enough information for it to understand the language. The concept of generative AI was that we could actually generate information and then train off the information that was generated. The machines could train themselves, the generation
Right.
of data. The use case that it was applied to was language. And the result of that was a technology that understood, in a way, people's meanings of their questions in a way that had never been understood before, and could understand written information in a way that had never been understood before. So 2 years ago, when you went to GPT and you asked it a question, what was happening was it was understanding your question in a way that was far more sensitive to your real meaning than your ability to maybe type in a Google search term. And it had been built off of looking at everything on the internet that was structured, and therefore had created a knowledge base that it could answer the questions from. What you probably didn't know was that it wasn't search. It wasn't actually going back into the internet to look for the answer. It was giving you the answer that it had remembered in the course of learning language. So we were actually seeing two things happening at the same time. One was a language competency, but the other was a corpus of knowledge.
Right.
And a lot of people thought that the magic was the knowledge, and so we were doing crazy things like testing it by asking it questions that it couldn't possibly know. I would do that, like ask it about myself, questions it couldn't possibly know. It would come up with made-up answers, and I thought that proved something. And what it proved was I didn't understand what the hell I was doing.
Yeah.
Like, because it was never about knowing information it had never seen before. It was
Right.
about understanding the question.
Right.
So now we're shifting to recognize it's a very different kind of a thing. That's the language application. It's also being used for visual information. But basically what it's doing is it's based on looking at known information and then creating inferences, taking all that new information, then training itself to do something with that new information. That's a maybe overly simplistic approach, but that's what its heart of it is for language models.
Right, and so when we think about that, right, initially we were thinking about, generative AI's applications in healthcare are very much, specific to specific use cases,
Right.
like clinical research and all. We hear about these early,
Right.
they can look through charts and infer different things, but it's the applications now in healthcare, the use cases that we're finding in healthcare are becoming a little bit different than these larger intents, right? Tell us a little bit about your perspective.
This is a really interesting shift. So this has been a shift in my view just in the last few months. We used to think about generative AI as a technology, a general purpose technology that we would bring into our business in the form of a piece of software, an application we'd use to do a specific task in our business, whatever that task may be. It might be managing your provider data or call center or whatever. But if you actually look in globally at how language models are being used, they're actually not being used by people through the lens of the company they work for, the industry they're in, but the actual jobs they personally do. So there was an interesting study published, a global study of by job type, not by industry, the most common uses, the professions that use generative AI the most. Number one was journalists. Number two and number three were both technology professionals. Number four, any guesses? Lawyers. They create a ton of documentation. It's a great first start. And I think about like in a law practice, for example, you as an individual lawyer might go negotiate a term sheet that might be 2 pages, and then someone is going to generate a 35-page contract. That's perfect for this stuff. Because the intellectual conversation was human, and then, by the way, it can go back and review it again. It can look for errors. It can do all kinds of things. So we're starting to see people look at their job and say, what in my job do I do? And does this technology give me a head start? Does it allow me to do certain things differently, change my time distribution? And so I think we're going to actually see it be proliferating through our industry more through the lens of, do we have enough people who are doing enough tasks where this technology and its language capabilities actually affect them? And if that's true, you're going to see more of it. So for example, we see a lot more, I describe lawyers, for example, and marketers, a lot more use in the life sciences than we do in healthcare delivery or healthcare payment, because of the amount of documentation, the amount of compliance, all of the things that they do. There are lots of people doing those jobs over there. And so they're using it there as an example.
Well, and I think that this also speaks to one of those things initially when this technology came in play. Many people were saying, this could potentially displace me. displace my role.
Right.
Right? I think there still is a little bit of that
Yeah.
conception out there. But do you think that, when you look at that, tell us a little bit about, how you see the role of generative AI in that computer-human dyad?
It's an interesting question. And if you look at it through the lens of a job, the one thing I think that we are realizing very, very clearly is that jobs are comprised of tasks, and the technology can take over tasks. In many cases, it cannot take over most or even all of the tasks that go into a job.
Right.
There are a few jobs, where all of the tasks can be replaced. That might be the category you'd be the most worried about, but certainly nobody in this room is in a job. I mean, there's an adage actually about doctors and AI, which applies to generative AI, which I think is fair. It says any doctor that can be replaced by AI should be replaced by AI. I mean, anybody in this room who can be replaced by generative AI will be replaced by generative AI, but most of you, all of you, don't fit into that category. So I'm not really worried about that. The bigger challenge is, what is the role of the person, the human, versus the technology? And what we're discovering is two things. One of them is some of the tasks are handed off, but for the most part, the human needs to stay in the loop. There's a human-machine interaction. The role of the human is to ask the question. The role of the machine is to answer the question. But you can't ask a question unless you understand what you're doing. So you need to ask smart questions, which means expertise. So continues to be a premium on expertise in order to be able to get the most out of it. If those of you who have been studying or reading about the world of generative AI have heard the concept of a prompt is a question. Better prompts, better answers. More experienced prompts, better answers. The same thing when you're using generative AI as effectively a type of a coworker. The good news is that at least for the next 20 years, the number of human beings alive globally that are going to be in the workforce, so older than 18 and let's say under 65, shrinks by 25%. So we have a global human labor shortage for 2 decades. And in the absence of technology that can scale human capacity, the economists worry about inflation rates that are over 4%. People worry about access problems in healthcare. We need this. We don't have a path out without being able to scale human capacity. This also makes another important point, which is that anyone who starts asking the question about a business case needs to understand that the technology doesn't deliver the business case. The change in the human job is what you need to deliver the business case. So, like, for example, if I take a person who does a job today and I bring in a piece of technology that takes 20% of their tasks away and gives them 20% of their time back, and I stop there, I just made everything worse. Because now I have a person who's only 80% productive plus the cost of technology. I only gain the benefit if I take the 80s, reaccumulate them, and redistribute them as new hundreds. The business case happens after the job changes, not after the technology is implemented. That's a really important learning lesson for businesses to understand in terms of thinking about the business case for these technologies.
It's almost like you're describing that the technology is already there to potentially meet this challenge, but us humans are lagging behind.
We're already seeing that.
Yeah.
We're absolutely already seeing that, not just in healthcare, but in multiple businesses. When you talk to the most senior people, they're already describing a chasm between the technology knowledge that their business people have and the business knowledge that their technology leaders have, and they're not able to close this chasm right now, the way things are organized, that they're actually requiring, we're going to need our business people to be more technology literate and our technology people to be more business literate, because this is no longer basement plumbing. This is it's 40% of what we do is language that the tech is doing like a coworker. It's much more like a coworker than plumbing. And that requires a different kind of knowledge and understanding.
Yeah, and I think some people have started to describe this, and Microsoft even took over this concept of co-pilots, right? Or having someone, an aide to assist you. Are you seeing those applications now occurring in health systems where, where is this happening first?
So the best place to think about it is it happens where there are consistent documentation tasks that are discrete and that you can separate off. So, for example, generally speaking across all industries, coding is the most common use, and contact center is the second most common use. And the reason contact center, regardless of the nature of why, if you have a lot of contact center work, because what happens in a contact center is usually the last 20% of that agent's time is writing down what just happened. That's severable. You can do that and give them their time back. Also, another big chunk of what they're spending their time on is looking for information. Generative AI and something called retrieval augmented generation vastly improves your ability to look not just at a single structured piece of information, but read documents, read images, read handwriting, do all kinds of things that normally a human would take their time trying to find their way through. So it gives back the agent a lot more, gives them time and improves the quality of their answer, so it actually gets to resolution faster. So whether you're in a contact center in an insurer or a contact center in an appointment function or anything else, you're seeing a big effect there. Those are two big ones. And then in the marketing and creative area as the first start. So organizations that do a lot of marketing, a lot of creative, and a lot of compliance documents. Those are also another big area that we're seeing a ton of work in.
And I'm hearing a lot of applications as well in like clinical note transcriptions and other things like that. I mean, that makes sense to me from even the initial thoughts of what generative AI could be. But how are we seeing that start to optimize into larger, as we've talked about here, sharing data among different associations?
Well, specifically in healthcare delivery, the task of documentation and the task of keyboard and typing has been a big burden of time, and particularly on clinicians. So the technology can significantly substitute for that task and give them their time back. And the products are now hitting general availability. And where they're being used, what's really amazing is that consistently the doctors who are using it are reporting less time at work. And in many cases, they're seeing more patients. And what's interesting about this is I know of multiple examples now where the doctors only need to see a few more patients to pay for the technology. And the institution never tells them that they need to see more patients, because if they did, they would argue. They just put the technology in and they just watch. And the doctors all see more patients because they can, not because they have to.
Wow.
It just naturally occurs. It's giving them that much time back. So that's pretty powerful use. Summarizing information, instead of reading a chart, it gives you a summary. That can be useful. It has some risks, but it can be useful. So for the doctor's life, it's big. We haven't really figured out how to make the nurse's life better, but we're working on that.
Yeah. Well, can it also answer our emails? Can we take care of that problem?
It can answer, the answer is yes, but it poses an interesting question. Because it can answer an email, but it's going to answer an email with things that are not necessarily requiring your judgment. And so you need to review it anyway. And the question is, what percentage of your time are emails going out that don't need your judgment? And maybe there's a more fundamental question, which is, why are we answering these damn emails?
So true.
Right.
So true. That's why we're also hearing use cases of like having your AI avatars show up at meetings that you don't need to be at too, right?
Well, the worst one is, I'm not kidding you, is people are putting it into technology, into performance review processes. So think about that. Ask if the AI can write a performance review for somebody, does anyone care? Like, is that even what we wanted? But we do it all the time, which says what we're actually doing is we're rewarding the length of the document as opposed to the insight. Like, give me 140 characters out of your brain, not a paragraph. That's a recycling of what you just said and what was in the... That's kind of the debate that goes on. By the way, my company does that right now, and I laughed at it the first time I saw it, because it was deployed on the software that we use. And it's like, why would I do that?
Kind of defeats the purpose a little bit. Well, it also brings up a point, as we think about this, when we talk about more and more usage of generative AI, I think there's a lot of questions about accuracy of the content, integrity of the content, those sorts of things. What's your perspective on that? I know there's been some studies that have showed that actually the performance of these solutions are getting better, right?
So there's two areas here this really touches on. One is this technology really about language or knowledge? Remember, the original concept of the generative AI and LLMs was to build language capabilities, but the only way to experience the language capabilities was through a question and answer experience. And so what you were actually seeing was the answer. the answer inside of a language model is no different than if I asked you to read a book, and then a week later I asked you to tell me something about what you read. You would have some synthesis of it that may or may not be perfectly accurate, versus asking you to go reread the book on the spot and find an answer for me. But we use it as a corpus of knowledge because it was efficient. We're seeing the field go in two directions, right? One way to think about it is that it is a corpus of knowledge. The other way to think about it is that I'm less worried about the knowledge that's retained and much more worried about its ability to access knowledge that I'm going to put in front of it as considered as accurate. They're both valid and they're very different. The problem is there is a gray zone in between, and here's what I mean by that. If you were to overly simplistically call a language model a reader, right? And I was going to give, and I produced a research article from a study about cancer, and I gave it to a high school graduate, a medical graduate, and an oncologist to read. Same article. They'd see different things because of their experience. Well, that's what these models are. And these models get smarter and they see more. And they're, the new models, the new frontier models are incredible because they understand context. So here's what I mean by context. If you've ever been to a play or watched a movie where the scene opens with two characters that have a conversation and they say words to each other, you may or may not fully understand that until you get to the end of the movie. Because the words, if you look at them phonetically or in simple semantic terms, mean one thing, but in the context of the movie, they mean something else. What's happening with these new models is their contexts are getting bigger and bigger, and their ability to hold information and therefore go back and make an inference to the top is very different. They get better. And so these bigger, more powerful models get smarter at inferences. Or at least they get smarter, and then the humans have to reinforce that. There's a machine part and a human part that is a different conversation, but they just get better.
So is this really artificial intelligence? I mean, is that the concept, right?
Yeah.
That are
so
we building?
That's a good setup question. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Noah Yuval Harari just wrote a book. It was released about 2 weeks ago. And in his book, he has a thesis. And he says AI is not artificial intelligence, it's alien intelligence. And what he means is the following, and I think it's a good mental construct. It has the ability to take certain things that human brains do and just perform them in an asymmetrically exceptional way that a human could never do. But not everything. There are some things it can't do even in a rudimentary way, the way a 2 or 3-year-old would learn something. So this idea that it's at the equivalent of a high school graduate is a total misnomer. It can answer test questions from something it's been trained on, but it can't learn the way a 2-year-old can learn how to make a truck out of Legos. So it's much more like an alien or an other than it is us symmetrically supercharged. And that if we start understanding it that way, we'll see how it fits into our lives in a different way. I think that's for where we're at today and where the technology is today, that's probably a really good way to think about it.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people now are saying, you and I have talked about this before, that this is such a nascent technology. And even, I hate to bring this up, but Gartner puts them on the hype cycle. It's like going into the trough of disillusionment, right? But that's probably not a great way to actually look at the technology application. Is that fair?
Well, actually it is if you understand what you're looking at. So the hype cycle is actually a maturity cycle, not a validation cycle.
Okay.
And by that I mean, I've used this analogy with Chris before. It'd be like looking at a 2-year-old and going, that guy's never going to amount to anything. Well, he's 2. I mean, how are you supposed to judge that, right? I mean, everyone has to go through learning stages, right? So we're actually in the process of the technology is getting better. We're learning how to use it. Its impact on society, we're just scratching the surface of it in terms of understanding it. So if you're looking at it today and saying, well, I don't see a big business case today, so hype, I don't buy that at all.
Right. That's not a great way to assess the capabilities of this technology. But what you're alluding to also is something that another topic that I think is important for many people in this room. We're thinking a lot about, we're in an industry that's highly regulated, right? And so there's some challenges around regulatory concerns and around privacy concerns.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about that because these larger technology platforms, ChatGPT, et cetera, they're very open and you put data in and it's shared and it's added to their larger model. So,
Yeah, well, Chris, I think it's a really important point because the concept of responsible AI predated generative AI and language models. And it was kind of an interesting sidelight, but because AI itself wasn't that pervasive, nobody really spent a lot of time worrying about it unless you were worrying on building a model and you were worried about weights and underlying data bias. But generative AI introduced a few problems into the responsible AI slipstream that didn't exist before. One of them is that the way generative AI works is it incorporates the knowledge that it acquired for language into future knowledge. And therefore, if you train it on information that's either private or confidential, it's forever no longer private or confidential. So you have to be very conscious about how you're going to use it. The other thing is that because at least language models are inherently expressive, people can say bad, wrong, mean, evil things, and so can the machines. And so the concept of language toxicity becomes an issue in that if this is literally speaking on your behalf, you need to make sure that it's speaking in a way that would be the way you would speak. What that has done is it has forced organizations to confront the issue of responsible AI before they implement the AI. We didn't see that. Now we're seeing organizations being forced to, and we saw in the early days, say maybe a year ago, we saw a lot of innovation groups that would bring back to their organizations this cool proof of a use case that they would build in the lab, and they go, what do you think? And the compliance officer, the security officer says, I don't know, but I know one thing, we are never doing what you just did. What do you mean? You don't understand, like the technology you use we're not going to do it that way, you haven't addressed this issue. So we think now that that organizations actually need to bring the whole responsible AI framework into their front and center governance in advance of the decisions about technology and partners and uses and everything else. Or they will start going down a road and then realize that they made a critical mistake because they hadn't thought the problem through.
Well, and much like the technology itself, it's ongoing and it's advancing and it's learning. Setting up these guidelines initially, the responsible AI guidelines, is good for the right now, but it also has to evolve, right?
Totally.
As the applications evolve?
Yeah, one example is that, so 2 years ago when health systems, providers started using it, a number of them got together voluntarily and they made a pact, if you will, that became a charter that's sort of, it's not official regulatory, but these groups have all agreed, which is they will not use a generative AI technology in a direct patient-facing advice way. That's a prohibition. You can use it everywhere, but under no circumstance will it be a surrogate for a clinician in terms of providing advice. People have said, well, that's great, but in some societies, we may not have any options. And so we're going to need to figure out how to, if the technology gets good enough and we get to conscribe it and the necessity requires it, maybe we're going to have to think about having more of a direct conversation with it. And so we're going to have to get a little smarter about that blanket prohibition and put certain kinds of circumstances around it that might make it permissible or not. And even then, we have to change our liability construct. In our society, the concept of fallibility is interesting and liability is interesting, and we don't know what to do if we can't assign it to a human. So we have a lot of work to do that's bigger than technology to get our head around it. But we also have needs that are bigger than we can meet currently. So these will travel together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you think about chatbots and other things like that being the front line, in other industries are already being used. I talk to robots all the time. Right? I talk to generative AI all the time, but in healthcare, we're starting to see that application as well.
There are some companies that are just releasing their first products into first use where, for example, the technology calls and is the nurse that's doing the follow-up, the discharge call or the pre-op call. They identify themselves as an agent, an AI. I personally listened to audio from some of the first uses, and it is so fascinating because they start laughing because it's just freakish. And all these models, by the way, there's a human listening to the call at the same time as the text so that they can intervene in case it goes off the rails. But if you listen to these conversations and you listen to the human side of it, but there are so many of them where they are, at the end of that, they're just completely blown away by what just happened. And here's the other part of it. These technologies have an enormous amount of patience. The nurse calling has 7 minutes.
Right.
They're documenting 20-minute calls.
Right.
Instead of 7-minute calls. because it costs nothing for the tech to talk for 20 minutes. So it's really amazing. I mean, we're just going way past what we thought the problem and the benefit was to a completely different place.
So let's say we're sitting here in 2 years, and we're now talking about not the terrible twos, but the fantastic fours. Where do you see this technology going?
Well, I think we're going to see a much more ubiquitous use of it around, from a consumer experience perspective on the front end in terms of call center. I think the other thing that you don't fully appreciate, but's going on behind the scenes, is that generative AI is a fantastic way of taking unstructured information and making it accessible for analytic purposes. So the entire repository of accessible information for all of our business purposes that's trapped is going to be untrapped. So there'll be a lot more new data. Some of it better, some of it confusing, but we're about to see a tsunami of data availability as well for various uses. I think in clinical care, you're going to see some really interesting uses emerge, like clinicians using it as a diagnostic aid in differential diagnosis for complex patients. There's some interesting early examples of it basically it doesn't diagnose a patient, it gives the doctor a list of considerations they wouldn't have thought of before, because think of it this way, a doctor only knows what they've seen. These things have seen everything. And it's shocking that they can surface theoretical diagnoses that doctors wouldn't have thought of, but if you see it, they might. So, one could envision a time where if you're a specialist, you take care of complex patients, and you're not using it, and you make a mistake, you got a problem.
Right. That kind of shifts the whole landscape here. That's interesting. I want to leave some time for audience questions as well.
Q&A.
Yeah, so Q&A time.
Smart questions. That's the bar that they raise. But
People are
I'm
blown away.
Not generated by AI.
Yeah. or so. Raise your. Oh, we've got one in the back.
So how does a JD MD get into AI?
You'll have to, my mother couldn't explain it to you if she was standing here, so yeah. That's a 40-year story for another time.
Well, I think the better way to answer that would be, how could they not be into AI? Because it sounds like this is going to be part of everyone's.
Yeah.
It's like asking people 20 years ago, how are you not using email?
Yeah.
Right.
And just to be pithy, but a side note, me personally, I will tell you the reason I'm here is because I have been worried about our dependency on human beings as a source of as our method of providing health care for a decade, more than a decade. And I saw it primarily as an economic problem. It was the cost of care was tied to labor costs, and we wouldn't solve the problem if we couldn't actually figure out how to get labor out of the means of production. This has been written about since the 1970s. And one thing that worried me was I saw no path for technology to take over human tasks and scale human labor in healthcare until generative AI. The reason I personally got involved in it was the first answer I saw to address the one issue, which is how do I extend human clinical expertise when the demand was outpacing the needs. So that's actually why my own personal interest really got me here.
Second question over here.
I'm from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and you were saying about the 70s. Right down the road is 3 Mile Island. Microsoft just announced that they're going to be buying the electricity from 3 Mile Island, because 3 Mile Island is actually starting up again, and it's all going to Microsoft. So the question is, will we have enough power in the United States to do it?
So big, important question. Anybody reads The Economist, there's a big issue. The most current issue has several pieces around a lot of these issues. I've talked to some of the founders of some of the technology companies, and basically what they're saying is that the biggest amount of power goes into the creation of these frontier models. Once the model weights are locked and you start stripping them down to their essential uses for specific applications, the energy consumption and the computing actually goes way down. So we're going to see, the thing is you don't need to run every question in the environment of the model itself that it was built in, and all the companies that are building products are going to be building them in much more lightweight ways. The question as to how many more frontier models can be built is a different question. And I mean, I think, but as a society, it's a chicken and egg. We're going to change the computing and we're going to change the energy consumption profile, but it is going to go up. Meanwhile, we're going to figure out how to create more proximity between the data centers and wasted energy and found energy, solar alternatives, nuclear. Everybody's figuring out how to put their Gen AI data centers next to energy sources because of this issue. So for sure, it's a complicated dance.
And
Another
for
question over here.
Hi, I'm Ron Irwong with De Facto Health. I've got a question about AI trust and safety among the health insurers, and what are the pitfalls? And in the spirit of CAQH, how could the payers get together and establish rules of the road to get ahead of regulation?
Are you thinking about it in the context of, will your member trust you, or you internally trust it for your own internal uses?
Members trust, and I guess also regulators trust.
So Pew just published a piece of information talking about the relative lack of public confidence in AI in healthcare unless it comes from their provider. That is no different, by the way. If you look at the data on quality reporting from 20 years ago, it said the exact same thing. They never trusted their health plan on quality data because they fundamentally don't trust sources of information that they think have a bias, an economic interest against them. It has nothing to do with the technology. It has nothing to do with the technology. It's a recognition. In fact, there's plenty of research that says people will trust inaccurate information from a source they trust more than accurate information from a source they don't trust. So we have to get our head around that reality, separate and aside from the AI. On the AI side, there's a few things we know. Number one, you have to disclose that you're dealing with an AI or you're going to violate trust. Number two, all of the work that's been done in customer service interactions with chatbots suggests that people are fine using a technology if they get yes for an answer, and are not fine if they get no for an answer. I know you think it's funny, but how many of you would take no from a bot as an answer? Nobody would, right? So when you build a service model, you need to understand the nature of the human. And if you're going to say no, it can't be a bot. So we're going to have to get that level of refinement into our thinking. Those are great questions. There's more to be learned, but that's how I'm thinking about it.
Well, and another, I'm sorry. There's another
Question here, Chris.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Marilyn Heine from AMA. And we've actually looked at some of the guardrails that need to be considered. And I was wondering what your perspective was on Gen AI, ChatGPT, the guardrails that you recommend.
Well, so I think there are rubrics for responsible AI that have multiple domains. And my personal view is that in any organization, you need to address each of those domains in a way that's relevant to your own organization, as opposed to like a one-size-fits-all. So, like data bias needs a place, language toxicity needs a place, privacy needs a place. All of them need a perspective. I think that's the way I would think about it. There's categories that every organization needs to have. The bigger question is, how much of this do we need as a government regulatory framework versus private sector? I think that's going on right now. And I think what's happening is that because generative AI has introduced risk around two issues, privacy and confidentiality, and especially around intellectual property and language toxicity, and industry wants to use these technologies, they are actually having to make decisions before the regulators can come up with them. They just can't afford to wait for regulators because their businesses are at risk.
And that's why you see the larger technology companies are coming together to create their own regulatory
voluntary frameworks.
Voluntarily, right? In order to
I personally think that from a healthcare delivery system perspective, because of the issue around human in the loop and language and knowledge risk, that I'm 100% behind making sure that you don't use the technology to provide direct advice to patients for the foreseeable future. Because I think if someone does do that, it's going to shut down innovation, because there will be a regulatory backlash. It will be overly generalized. That's the nature of how regulation is, and it will stifle innovation in other useful areas. So I do worry about companies that say they don't want to put any kind of regulatory posture forward because they're just generally anti-regulation, that they run the risk that somebody, a bad actor, not them, but somebody who competes with them, will shut everybody down.
Another question.
Hi. Being a pioneer in Gen AI, representing one of the tech firms, what do you think is on a compatibility for non-healthcare industry and healthcare industry, the Gen AI model? What is the advancement compared to the other industry, and what do you see a future linkage between them for the total advancement of the whole model?
Yeah, I mean, in general, if you just look at raw adoption of technology in terms of, and it's still early, but even if you look at early adoption, not late adoption, early adoption, the healthcare industry for sure is using less of it than other sectors. But that's because, going back to my observation about the nature of the tasks, we don't have as much task concentration around the tasks that have the easy severability material ability to allocate to, particularly delivery system, which is when you talk about healthcare writ large, all the math is about the delivery system. That's where the bodies are, that's where all the work gets done. There's no way that the technology is good enough to take over a material amount of tasks right now compared to other sectors. So to me, it doesn't prove anything except the fact that our task list is much harder than where the technology is ready to go easily. Plus, like just redesigning work in clinical environments is much harder than redesigning work in a contact center, much harder. And therefore, it's just going to be a bit of a challenge. So I don't read that much into it. The life sciences sector is actually using a lot more Gen AI. They're using more Gen AI than average. They're using it as a source of data, as an input into discovery. They're using it for all their regulatory material, their marketing material. There's a huge amount of things that they're doing. And they're actually, and here's the other one that I think is an interesting observation. They have a culture of experimentation. Their business is test and learn. They're acculturated to doing that. We're not in the delivery system acculturated to test and learn. So it's just a fundamental violation of our instincts to try stuff out in the same way.
Thank you.
think one more question.
Yes.
Kevin Terrell, Birch AI. We've been deployed in Fortune 500 healthcare for a couple of years now, actually, with generative AI models. And one of the lessons that we've seen is actually, I'll come back to my Six Sigma experience, which is humans are not Six Sigma, they're not Three Sigma, they're 1.5 Sigma, they're always 1.5 Sigma, right? And what the deployment of our Gen AI models start to show is they start to expose that, right? So can you talk about what lessons you might have seen on the part of organizations in terms of driving quality and using AI, whether it's generative or not, to drive quality improvement?
Well, so there's a lot of different ways that I'm hearing your question could go. I think one of the interesting questions is, and you talk about the technology relative to humans, the technology actually can make, in aggregate, less errors than humans can in many cases. However, as a society, our standard for expectations for technology approaches perfection versus human. And that is a mental mindset that we struggle with significantly, which is how good does it have to be? The autonomous vehicles right now that exist in the lab drive as well as the worst drivers in a high-risk pool. But we won't allow them to be on the road, generally, except in Arizona. But the reason is, and it's interesting, it's like, well, but we let bad drivers in high-risk pool on the road. And so how good does it have to be? Does it have to be perfect? So as a society, we do struggle with one issue, which is this issue of how good is the technology. I think what we're going to end up seeing is much more thinking about the technology augmenting human capacity, because we are not prepared mentally to give the liability of the technology. We don't know what to do, because Six Sigma is not perfect. And everybody thinks about the one failure, and they want to know where to assign blame. And so I think we're going to end up having a human-machine dyad. And the issue for the humans is then using the technology to augment their job. And the liabilities will be on the human side to keep getting better. The standard of practice will keep getting better is probably how it plays itself out.
Yeah.
That's my guess.
I guess we will see how that evolves. Okay. And with that, I think that's been a really good overview of where we're at with the Terrible Twos.
Great.
So,
thanks, Chris.
Thank you all.